Folk music on Black Power 96, and we just did our little Southern Soul thing. And on the line is Dr. Gerald Horne, the author of The Counter Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery and Jim Crow, and the Roots of U.S. Fascism. And Dr. Horne is working on a new book, probably working on a couple of new books, but I guess we're talking about the Washington, D.C. book. But first of all, Dr. Horne, how are you doing today?
It's all good. What about you?
Sam Cooke would say, wonderful, I'm fine. Can't complain.
I'm doing well as well.
Great.
October the 9th, there's a whole bunch of birthdays out there. Omali Ishatella, his wife, Ona, it's their birthday. And also it's the birthday of the great Yusef Lateef. Could you just basically give us like just a little summary of Yusef Lateef, the great saxophonist?
Well, I'd recommend his album, The Blue Yusef Lateef, which you should be able to find easily. He, like many great musicians, including Donald Byrd and Ron Carter, had roots in Michigan, Elvin Jones, the entire crew of Jones Brothers. He also spent time in West Africa as well. And I should also mention that tomorrow is the birthday of Thelonious Monk. And all day, actually starting at midnight Eastern time, which would be 11 p.m. Central and 9 p.m. Pacific, on WKCR.org, there will be 24 hours straight of Thelonious Monk music. Now, with regard to these WKCR specials, I should warn listeners in advance that being a full service music station, those who are spinning the platters oftentimes feel compelled to interject commentary. So saying 24 hours straight is kind of misnomer, but certainly you'll receive an overdose of monk music beginning tonight, 12 midnight Eastern. WKCR.org.
Let me say, for the people living in Toronto and Canada, Eric Mercury work with Thelonious Monk Jr. I think Thelonious Monk Jr., I don't know if that was his birth name, but T.S. Monk and Eric Mercury worked together they had several projects together. But we've gotten that out of the way. I guess the first question is, we wanted to talk about the importance of the formation of European political community this past week in Prague, and what does that mean to? First of all, what is that, and how does that affect Africans, and oppressed people?
Well, the European political community has just been organized at the behest of France, President Macron. It is a reflection of the fact that the Western European nations have a real dilemma on their hands. On the one hand, they endured 4 years of Trump, who sought to destabilize the European Union. He thought the European Union was second only to China as a threat to U.S. hegemony. He actually threw things at a meeting with Chancellor Merkel. He tossed stuff at her, showing his disgust with the EU and Germany in particular. And the European Union thought that once the Democrats came to power, they would have a breathing space. Well, but what they found, of course, is that with the Democrats, you get dragged into wars, which is what's happening now, which is destabilizing the European economy. It's turning the European economy into a kind of joke. We had our fun talking about the perils that the Western European nations face. And so when France seeks to organize the European political community, which, by the way, excludes the United States and also excludes Russia but includes Ukraine, includes Moldova, includes even Israel, by the way. I'm not sure how Israel made its way into Europe. That's another discussion for another day. But
Right.
it's a reflection of the fact that the Europeans feel that they're caught on the horns of a dilemma, that they cannot really trust the United States of America. Now, that, I think, opens up possibilities for people of African descent to play on the contradictions between and amongst the North Atlantic powers. Certainly, it creates the possibility for Russia to play up on these contradictions, which it most certainly will do. But once again, it also bespeaks a major theme I've been talking about for weeks now, which is how absent from the global scene are Africans in the United States. I won't dare to speak for Africans in Canada, in the sense that all of these significant changes are occurring. It's as if, Lenin once said, sometimes in decades it seems like hardly anything happens, and then in a matter of days it seems like decades happen. And that's what we're going through now with this crisis in Ukraine, with the speech by Putin saying that Russia's turning its back on the West and turning towards the East and the South. Now you have the North Atlantic bloc showing strains. But once again, it's up to us to put our collective heads together. But if there are those who don't want to pay attention, I'm not sure what we can do.
You're listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96. This is Melinda Francis, Norman Richmond. We're on the line with Dr. Gerald Horne, the author of The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery and Jim Crow, and the Roots of U.S. Fascism. You have a question, Melinda?
Yeah, why don't we stay in Europe, and we didn't get to, UK imploding last week, so.
But interesting, Britain was invited to the European Political Community Summit in Prague. Britain is suspect as far as Western Europe is concerned, because as far as France is concerned, to be more precise, because it's seen as the U.S. poodle, and that if you invite Britain, it's like inviting Uncle Sam. And now, of course, Britain is going through a real crisis, because interestingly, that their chancellor of the Exchequer, which is in effect the number 2 position behind the prime minister, is a man of West African descent, Kwasi Kwarteng, if I'm not mistaken with regard to his name. And he is a real right winger. I mean, he basically introduced a Reagan-style budget just a few weeks ago, calling for tax cuts for the wealthy, financed by borrowing, the so-called markets, which means the international capitalist class, revolted. The British pound is falling. I recall a time when the British pound was worth $2.40. Now it's about worth as much as $1, which means that when I travel to London in a few months, I can probably live like a king, not like King Charles III, but like a Negro king. But and so what I find interesting about that, about what's going on in Britain and the collapse of the economy, is that in part it's a reflection of the Ukraine crisis, the cost of energy. That's one of the problems with this budget. And speaking of the cost of energy, the other significant development in recent days has been that the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, led by Saudi Arabia, have decided to cut supply, which will then lead to a rise in the price of a barrel of petroleum, which will lead to a rise in the price of gasoline at the pump. In the United States, where mass transit is not that prevalent, that's going to hammer cities like Los Angeles, where the price of a gallon of gas is already reaching past $7, which for the United States is quite a bit. It may not be quite a bit other countries, but for this country it's quite a bit because wages are not that high. And so the Democrats are in a fury, in a frenzy about Saudi Arabia. And I'm speaking about centrist Democrats and left-wing Democrats, so-called, because they feel that, number one, the Saudi-Russian move, in their minds, was crafted to hurt the Democrats' chances in the elections taking place in a few weeks that will determine the shape of Congress. And second of all, they feel that it shows that the Saudis are now aligning with Russia and with China and this rising bloc to the detriment of the United States and the North Atlantic allies, which of course brings us back to the formation of the European political community, because that also reflects this growing suspicion that we're living through this transition and that you can't rely upon Uncle Sam anymore. And so it's like, I'm sure you recall playing musical chairs in elementary school. The music stops. Some people were left without a chair to sit in, and you're out of the game. Well, basically, that's what's happening. It's a game of musical chairs. Nobody wants to be left without a chair. And so the Saudis have really infuriated forces on the Democratic side of the political spectrum, Democratic Party side. And obviously, this cut in supply will have tremendous knock-on effects with regard to the Western European economy, which brings us back to Great Britain, and the fact that its economy is imploding with no end in sight.
And you're listening to Dr. Gerald Horne, Melinda Francis, and this is Diasporic Music on Black Power 96. And could you talk about the implosion of Credit Suisse? And many people, a lot of people listening to this show don't know what Credit Suisse is. Could you talk about that?
Well, it's the reason I bring it up for a couple of reasons. One, it's a Swiss headquartered investment bank and pillar of global capitalism. But the reason I bring it up is, number one, it's having problems now, and it manages so much capital that its problems could lead to an implosion in the entire capitalist world. Recall what happened in 2007, 2008 with Lehman Brothers collapse on Wall Street that had knock-on effects globally. But Credit Suisse is in that same category. I also bring it up because until quite recently, ironically enough and strangely enough, it was headed by a man of West African descent, the multilingual African manipulator and capitalist Tidjane Thiam, who happened to be married, by the way, to a Black American woman until recently, speaking of Annette Anthony, a lawyer in her own right. And basically, he was railroaded out of that gigantic enterprise. And so it seems like poetic justice that now that enterprise, Credit Suisse, is on the rocks. But it's not only Credit Suisse, which is on the rocks, it's also Deutsche Bank, which, as you know, has been quite close to Donald J. Trump. It might be collapsing too. And so once again, these are major foundational bedrocks of European capitalism and imperialism that are on the ropes, that are in trouble. And that's the sort of thing that the Saudis look at, the people all over the world look at when they decide where to place their bets. And it reminds me of what the late Osama bin Laden once said when he thought he was riding high. He says that folks around the world, they bet on the strong horse, not the weak horse. At that time, he thought that his movement was the strong horse. Well, I'll leave it for others to determine if that was accurate. But certainly, is you look at the capitalist world right now, and you look at the implosion of the British economy, you look at the fact that Credit Suisse is on the rocks, Deutsche Bank, Trump Bank is on the rocks, it gives you reason to doubt the viability of North Atlantic capitalism and imperialism.
And you are listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96. Could you talk about regime change in Moscow? Or is there going to be a regime change in Moscow?
Well, after looking at this Ukraine crisis from basically every conceivable angle, it seems to me that the only way out for the North Atlantic countries is regime change in Moscow. And keep in mind that that does not necessarily mean, as the certain pundits would have it, that this is all Putin's war, because to a certain degree, those who could replace Putin are more hawkish than he is with regard to this crisis. Even the New York Times has reported that more hawkish forces in Moscow thinks that the policy militarily has not been hard enough. If you look at the communications of Dmitry Medvedev, you might recall, was briefly president in the Obama years, when, because of law and regulation, Putin had to step down. He, in many ways, is more hawkish than Putin with regard to prosecuting this war. But you know how the Yankees are. I recall when they were trying to get rid of Mr. al-Assad, Bashar al-Assad, the leader of Syria. And I recall the time when, under the Obama administration, they were basically in bed with religious zealots, Al-Qaeda, because they were so hungry to get rid of al-Assad. They're basically saying, look, we'll get rid of this guy and we'll worry about what comes afterwards later. That's their basic philosophy. I guess the reasoning, if they have any reasoning, is that if there is regime change in Moscow, that Russia will be so discombobulated that it'll make it easier prey to be subdued and then, like the Soviet Union, broken up, plundered, and looted. I recall that that strategy in Syria almost worked until Russia intervened. I recall when the opposition forces were about 12 miles from Damascus. That's before Moscow intervened. That's one of the reasons why the United States is so upset with Moscow, because they almost had Mr. al-Assad's head on a platter. However, executing regime change in the 11th largest economy in the world, that by some measures has more nuclear weapons than the United States does, that's a tall order. That's a heavy lift. And I think that this is being openly discussed bespeaks the desperation of the North Atlantic countries. And in that context, you should pay attention to the fact that of late, the US president, Joseph R. Biden, has been talking about Armageddon, basically talking about the end of the world. And so if you haven't had any fun lately, you might want to go out and enjoy yourself, because the Yankees wanting to go for the gusto and in the process blow up the world. So have some fun while there's still time.
Well, the most honorable Elijah Muhammad said the Armageddon is coming, and so how many people are supposed to be saved? 144,000 of us. Get ready. I guess you should get straight with the Lord so you can get on the mothership, right?
Well, do something, because the Yankees are getting a little desperate now. And once again, it bespeaks this crisis, because if you do an analysis of the conflict in Ukraine, you could receive the impression that the recent victories, quote unquote, of the Kiev regime on the battlefield are due not only to the arming by the United States, but also because Ukraine is suffering many battlefield losses. So what's happening might be a false dawn. That is to say that the Ukrainians seem to be advancing, but they're advancing at a heavy cost. The Russians might be executing a rope-a-dope. That is to say, letting the Ukrainians punch themselves into submission and then counterattacking furiously, like Muhammad Ali used to do in the ring, particularly against George Foreman in Congo, then Zaire, in the 1970s. And Washington feels that it cannot afford to lose this conflict to Ukraine. That's why we have all this loose talk now about Armageddon, about the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962, or the October Crisis, as it's called in Havana, when the world came quite close to nuclear catastrophe. Mr. Biden has been talking about that as well. So once again, folks have a couple of choices. You can join the movement to restrain the warmongers in Washington, or you can go out and have a good time before the world comes to an end.
Have a question, Melinda?
Yeah. What's going on with the UN Security Council revamp?
Well, that's interesting. Once again, the United States, they use, I guess we're quoting the Nation of Islam a lot today. I guess that speaks their ideological weight. Nation of Islam oftentimes talks about, at least Minister Farrakhan always talks about folks needing backup. And so Washington feels it needs backup, this conflict with Russia and China, etc. So the idea is to expand the permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. That's the top table in terms of who ostensibly rules the world or forms and shapes international law. Now the top table, as you know, includes Russia, China, United States, Britain, and France, a result of the configuration following the end of World War II, 1945. Mr. Biden says that there should be another Asian member, likely India, although I guess some might put forward Japan, a Latin American member, likely Brazil, and an African member, likely South Africa, although don't rule out Nigeria, because it not only has a larger population than South Africa, the largest on the continent, but it has a larger economy. And then the internal conflicts in Nigeria between and amongst Hausa, Yoruba, Igbo, and others, it's almost made to order for manipulation by the imperialists. And so I'm sure they already have a number of think tanks working on projects to manipulate Nigeria. In any case, I dare say that this is going to happen sometime in the next decade. And I think it could be a step forward for African development and progress. But right now, it's too soon to tell.
You're listening to Diasporic music on Black Power 96. We wanted to talk about sanctions on Algeria, but we were talking about the Nation of Islam. But Algeria was or is a predominantly Islamic state, but one of the leaders was Ahmed bin Bella, and he was a very, very, I guess he was Muslim, but he was very, very close to socialism. And the Algerians had an embassy where they welcomed the Black Panther Party and other revolutionaries from other parts of the world. And we're talking about, they're talking about sanctions on Algeria. Could you talk about that?
Well, once again, the United States is very upset with Algeria. Number one, because it's still close to Moscow in terms of arms dealings. Number two, the Western Europeans have their eyes set hungrily and ravenously on Nigerian energy, natural gas, and oil. Algeria is playing hardball. They're just not going to give it away, which is basically what the North Atlantic countries want. And I think that assuming life proceeds on this planet, eventually somebody's going to have to do an analysis pointing out how these countries that were built on the slave trade and colonialism, they're used to getting stuff for free, particularly when it comes to resources from Africa. And so if it doesn't come for free, or at least bottom barrel costs, they get upset. So now they're talking about sanctioning Algeria at the same time they want Algerian energy. And by the way, in terms of attention to Algeria, the New York Times has been, once again, in lockstep with the U.S. ruling class, and you should expect no less. They've had a number of articles on Algeria of late, including today, critical of Algeria, but at the same time, look at the article in today's New York Times on RAI, R-A-I, in terms of the kind of transliteration we use in our alphabet in the United States, which is this Algerian form of popular music and women's dance, not to be confused with belly dancing, by the way, which is a phenomenon to be found in the neighbor to the east, speaking of Egypt. But it's very intriguing because RAI music, as you know, there's been an attempt to popularize that music on this side of the Atlantic.
Correct. You're listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96 with Melinda Francis and Norman Richmond. And could you give us a report on Freedom Now?
Oh, yes, I'm glad
your radio show.
Well, our radio show, basically, because you and Melinda and Lisa are part of the Freedom Now family as well. But listeners,
appreciate that.
Oh, we appreciate you. Our program yesterday, as I promised last week, we dealt with Maroons, the Great Dismal Swamp on the North Carolina-Virginia border, thousands of square miles where the Africans escaped, just like they escaped in Brazil and Palmares, and escaped in Jamaica, and escaped in Florida, which also has swamps, and bedeviled the enslavers for decades, and were really never defeated. There were thousands of Africans living there. So check out that interview. It's very interesting. I must say, it's a new book by an author. And then we dealt with another author, just wrote a book on lynching in Texas. And as you know, Texas is notorious to this day for being an oil capital. So the rather ghastly twist introduced with regard to lynching in Texas is they used to boil the Negroes in oil, basically. And the author, if you can stomach it, talks about how difficult it is to burn somebody alive in oil, because they would burn them alive. They wouldn't kill them first. They'd start a flame and then throw the Negroes into the flame. And she talked about it too as a sort of pre-radio, pre-television form of entertainment for the settler class. Thousands would amass for the quote entertainment unquote. Pictures would be taken. Digits would be hacked off of the victim. It was not only Black men and teenagers and adults victim, but women too. And by the way, in coming weeks, we're going to have some interesting interviews about the lynching of Black women in the United States, which research is turning up new revelations. And I think what Freedom Now points out is that a lot of people I've come to find, I guess because it's comforting, they think they know everything there is to know. But that's not research. You got people doing research at all sorts of different things, coming up with all sorts of new revelations. And it's just like a doctor. You want your doctor to keep up with current developments in the literature, because you don't want to go to a doctor who's practicing medicine that was current in 1975, but has fallen behind the times. And so likewise, with regard to our political friends, the way to keep up with what's going on and what has happened and the latest trends of development is to tune into Freedom Now, kpfk.org in Los Angeles. 11 a.m. Pacific on Saturdays, 2 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Central.
Well, the last thing I want to say, I hate to end on this note, but I remember one of the most influential things in my life was when I read Lerone Bennett's Before the Mayflower, and he talked about, I think this took place in Valdosta, Georgia, how they took a black woman, Mary Turner, was pregnant. They cut her stomach open, stomped the baby, and then burned her up. I will never forget that. As long just reading that, but I mean, my own great grandfather, Louis Richmond, he was lynched, so I know that racism and white supremacy is realer than real.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned Mary Turner. We're interviewing her on Freedom Now, the author of the book on Mary Turner, speaking of Julie Armstrong, a definitive study of the lynching of Mary Turner, which is just as you described. She was 8 months pregnant. She was lynched. Her womb was cut open. Fetus was killed too. It's quite a gruesome and ghastly story. So tune into Freedom Now. Make it a habit. Saturdays, 11 a.m. Pacific.
And thank you very much, sir. We will see you in the whirlwind, and I would like to thank Lisa Watson for her